Hello, dear viewers. Namaskar. Welcome to Moksha Media. You are with Moksha Hiremat. Generally, the literature bends the mind and arts of readers and listeners. It gives a sort of pleasure and spirituality. It shows trends. It indicates the future, culture, and civilization of that particular language and literature. In order to know these things, we have to understand the literary periods of that time. Without coming to know the literary periods of that time, it is very difficult to know the trends and tenets of that period. So, every literature classifies its periods into so many parts and sections. Of course, the Kannada literature is not an exception to this. In order to understand properly the trend of that period, we have to know the period of that time. So, in this sense, the classification of literary period is very important. So, we have the classification of these literary trends in Kannada literature in particular and other literatures in general. Of course, when we try to classify Kannada literary period, different opinions have been given. Different critics have classified Kannada literary period in their own way and in the best of them also. They try their best, no doubt about it. In the background of their time, the trend, their taste, and their evolution, their culture and civilization. Some critics classify Kannada literary period as pre-old Kannada, old Kannada, medieval Kannada, and modern Kannada. Pre-old Kannada is preceding the 7th century of Common Era. Old Kannada from 7th century of Common Era to the 11th century of Common Era. Medieval period from the 11th century to 16th century of Common Era, and from 16th century onwards it is modern literary period. This is one of the classifications. And another classification is that pre-old Kannada, old Kannada, Jaina literary period, Virashaiva literary period, Brahmin literary period, and modern period. Pre-Old Kannada precedes 7th century of Common Era. From 7th century to the 11th century, it is Old Kannada. From 11th century to the 16th century or 17th century, it is Medieval Kannada. From 17th century onwards, it is Modern Kannada. Some critics even classify periods in the names of particular persons popular at that time. They might be poets, they might be popular leaders, they might be trendsetters, and etc. etc. They classify Kannada literary period as Old Kannada, Pampa's period, Basava's period, Kumaravyasa's period, and of course modern Kannada. Some others classify Kannada literary period as Ganga's period, Rashtrakota's period, Hoysala's period, Vijayanagara period, and modern period, etc. etc. in the names of empires ruled at that time. But some of the critics classify Kannada literary period on the basis of forms such as Champu literature, Vachana literature, Ragale literature, Shatpadi literature, Sangatya literature, novel literature, short stories literature, dramas literature, essays literature, and blank verse, etc. etc. And like this, critics try their best to classify Kannada literary periods in this way. But when we go through these literary periods, we come to know some shortages of them, even with due respect to the critics who have classified. Because at that time it might be a trend, yet the literature goes on and on. Yes, we have a lot of data in the modern days. Again, this classification should be reclassified. That is, comments should be recommented. In the background of our knowledge, our data, our growth, and the trends prevailing at this time. Of course, it is common for the growing literature. Kannada as a growing literature, it is necessary to relook into the opinions of those elders with due respect to them. Because in those days, it was not that much of easy to classify with a mere information. But our elders did it with their best. So we do not deny the effort of them. With due respect, we have to relook into the opinion of them. Of course, some critics classify literary period on the basis of language. But one fine time that language is deviated from literature. Of course, literature is based on the language. Language, the language contains or uh, the language contains some framework, but the literature is beyond that framework. It depends upon his expression, the way of expression, the tenet he uses or she uses, the understanding, the approach, the knowledge, the culture, the civilization, the growth, the development, etc., etc. Of course, on the basis of these things, we have to relook into them. And others classify it on the basis of the religion, on the basis of some other things. Sometimes they are prejudiced because in the fit of their religion, or as they think that this is the superior one, automatically there is a possibility of that prejudice. Of course, it is human weakness. We do not say that is wrong, but that is one of the aspects which confines the classifications. And others try to classify Kannada, the Kannada literary period, on the basis of the names of those persons popular at that time. Of course, it is an un-Indian. We know the Indian culture and civilization does not prefer hero worship. This classification on the basis of the names of a particular person is an un-Indian and is yielded to the foreign culture. And that un-Indian does not become an Indian trend, does not become an Indian concept. That doesn't mean we deny the importance of heroes. They have their own place in the history of development and growth. But at the same time, they are part and parcel of a community in which they are born and bred. They are part and parcel of a culture in which they are born and bred and fed. So, giving due respect to those persons, at the same time, we have to take into account the culture and civilization of that time. And more than that, we do not prefer hero worship. And Indian culture and civilization never prefers hero worship. That is what we have seen in our history, in our culture, and in our civilization. That is why classifying the Kannada literary period on the basis of a particular heroes becomes an Indian in my opinion. It is an un-Indian trend. It is an alienated trend. Of course, it is not. It is trying to transplanting. That transplanting may be good or bad. Sometimes its roots are deeper. Sometimes they are loose. Of course, transplanting is not that much of deeper. So that is why that naming, that classifying literary period on the basis of names is the influence of an alienated culture and civilization. And sometimes critics classify literature on the basis of particular poets who are popular at that time. But of course, they may be popular by using proverbs and the trends of Kannada culture and civilization, but their work is incomplete. They wrote some parts of the poetry and other parts of the poetry have been completed by others. In such a position, if you try to classify the literary period on the basis of those incompleted poetry, automatically it is not justifiable. And sometimes that religious prejudice is there, but Indians are not prejudiced on the basis of religion. It is a vast country and we are not narrow-minded. We are very liberal. We have the culture of receiving but not rejecting. But there are some cultures which have the culture of rejecting but not receiving. And India is different from them. Ours is an assimilating culture. And that is why, on the basis of this assimilation, we have to assimilate the things which are prevailed at that time. That means we have opened the windows to those things, but we are not opened our doors. And that is why we have to relook into the literary periods again and again. From the basis of these points, I would like to classify the Kannada literary period like this. That is, pre-old Kannada literature, Jain's literature, Veerashaiva's literature, then Vaidic's literature, missionaries' literature, modern literature, and neo-modern Kannada literature. That is, we have to classify the Kannada literary period into 7 periods in order to assimilate all those things which are prevailed, which are pushed to the Kannada literary field. So, pre-old Kannada precedes 16th century of Common Era. From 16th century to onwards, that is 11th century, we say it is Jaina's literature, Jaina's period. From 11th century to the 16th century, we have to classify it as Veerashaiva's period. From 16th to 18th century, we have to say it is Vaidic's literature. From 18th century to the first part of the 19th century, we have to say modern literature, and from 19th century onwards, we have to say it is neo-modern Kannada literary period. Of course, before 6th century of Common Era, we don't have any literary works. That doesn't mean there are no literary pieces, but they are not available. They are in different forms. They are only on the rock edicts. They are in the form of shasanas. They are in the form of inscriptions. From 6th century onwards, we have the mentioning of literary periods. For example, the Ganga king Durvinita, whose works are mentioned in the works of the later poets. But those works are not found. But doesn't mean there is no literary work. There is a forming of literary, there is a literary forming, no doubt about it, but unfortunately the works of that period are not found. So only Kaviraja Marga is the first available work we have, and Vaddarajane is only the available prose work we have. It is in the 9th century and 10th century. So from 6th century to the 11th century, we have the dominance of Jaina's literature. That doesn't mean others are not produced any literary piece, but they are produced, but their number is very, very, very meager. In those centuries, that is the 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, 10th century and 11th century, these Jainas literatures played a prominent role in producing the classical literary works. From 11th century onwards until 16th century, we have Veerashaiva's literature. That is, especially Vachana Sahitya has come into existence. It gives expression to the persons, it gives expression to the voiceless persons, it is voiced to the voiceless persons. It represented the exploited, and it tries to bring a harmony between exploited and exploiter. Of course, it leads to a social movement, and this gives emergence of that Vachana Sahitya. But after 12th century, Vachana Sahitya is gradually faded out. It gives way to Ragale, Shatpadi, Sangatya, etc., etc., which so many Veerashaiva poets produced good literary pieces. So, it is from 11th century to the 16th century, we have Veerashaiva period. From 16th century to the 18th century or 19th century, first part of the 19th century, we have the Vedic literature. Of course, from 16th century to the 18th century, we have Vedic literature. There we have Sangatya. Especially here we have to remember some Kirtanas, especially Purandaradasa and Kumaravyasa, who wrote Karnata Bharata Kathamanjari, but only he completed 10th chapters of that Kathamanjari, and other 8 chapters have been completed by others. But Purandaradasa's Kirtanas are followed even today, not only in Karnataka, but outside Karnataka. And that is why there we can see the Vedic literary period. And in the 18th century, we have the missionary literary period. Especially we have Mogling, who lay foundation for the journalism, and Ferdinand Kittel, a very fantastic person who composed a dictionary. Even today it is very valuable. And Christopher Caldwell, who translated Shabdamani Darpana into English. And of course Juggler, who composed a dictionary. But these are not English men. They are missionaries from different countries of Europe, and they came to India and they came to Karnataka, and they studied Karnataka culture and civilization, and they produced those works, and by that they contribute to a large extent to the development of Kannada literature. And after that we have B.L. Rice and E.P. Rice. B.L. Rice composed the Karnataka Gazetteer, and E.P. Rice wrote the history of Kannadi's literature. So, like that, these missionaries play a prominent role in the development of Kannada literary period. That's why this period should not be neglected, even though their number is very less. It should be appreciated because they come from other countries, they learn Kannada and they write in Kannada and they give a lot of contribution to Kannada, a historical contribution to the development of Kannada literature and its period. And after that, we have the modern period. Modern period consists of Navodaya and Pragatishila. And after that, we have neo-modern period. It consists of Navya, Barahagara Vakkuta, that is the Writers Association, and Bandaya, that is the rebellious literature, then Dalit literature, that is the exploited literature, etc. etc. These are the different expressions in neo-modern Kannada literary period. While trying to know the particular trend of these things, we have to keep in our mind these literary periods. Without understanding these literary periods, the study of literature or knowing the trends of that period will be incomplete. Of course, these different trends, these different periods have their own things. So I try to classify the Kannada literary period without any prejudice in the background of Indian culture and civilization, in the background of religion and spirituality, which is the spirit of Kannada culture and civilization in particular, and Indian culture and civilization in general. Because as the time goes on and on, the comment should be recommented. That is what here I tried in this classification of the Kannada literary period. I hope I have convinced the home the truth. Please subscribe. See you in the next episode. Thank you. Namaskar.